for joining us on Friday night, or for someone maybe Friday afternoon. And we are very excited to see so many people who are interested in joining us in this discussion of how we can use World Readiness Standards to improve our instructions, to improve our curriculum, to improve our programs, and to bridge also pre-college and college programs and instructors. So it is my pleasure to welcome everyone here. And before we have a chance to introduce everyone, I would like to tell you and remind you, if you haven't received the flyer yet, that this roundtable begins a series of webinars and follow-up teachers' lounges this spring, organized by the American Council of Teachers of Russian. And the focus of the whole webinar series is on World Readiness Standards and how we can integrate them in our language, Russian language classrooms, and also how we can design various learning activities and our language curriculum in general based on these standards, and improve our environment, educational environment. So please check out our Facebook page. It includes the post, and will be notifying all the members and also in general non-members about upcoming webinars. So the topic of our next webinar will be teaching Russian through film, led by Olga Mizropova, Iowa State University, and Linda Benedette from Brown University. This will be on February 25th. We'll have also a webinar on project-based learning in pre-college and college Russian language classroom on March 25th. And on April 22nd, we'll have the last webinar in this series, Russian outside of the classroom, community-based teaching. Each of the webinars will be followed by an informal teachers lounge. All members are welcome to join and share your experiences and your samples of learning activities and your language curriculum related to this topic. And of course, I would like to thank our partners, the Center for Russian East European Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, and also Russian East European Institute at the Indiana University, as they generously offered to cover one registration fee for non-members of one of the webinars. So please email us if you're not member. Email us your contact information. Also, I would like to take a moment and ask you or recommend you to join our ACTR, because American Council of Teachers of Russian, because it offers a lot of different services and programs, professional development opportunities, as well as Russian Olympiada of Spoken Russian, numerous college and pre-college laureate awards, and as well as other activities and programs. So I think at this point I will stop, and if I will ask Cindy Martin, would you like to introduce our presenters?
Sure. So we want to be respectful of your time, and I want to give our participants as much time as possible, and also give all of you a chance to ask questions and have a lively discussion afterwards. So I'm going to get started right away. We're going to hear from Jane Shuffleton, who I'm sure you know all. I'm really honored to be facilitating this with these colleagues of ours. Jane Shuffleton is going to talk to us first. Jane, former teacher of French and Russian at Brighton High School in Rochester, and Jane served on the task force to write the standards for Russian for K-12, and then also chaired the task force to revise them to include higher ed and secondary, post-secondary. Betsy Sandstrom, then we'll hear from Betsy Sandstrom, a star teacher and a longtime serving member in various capacities at American councils, and Russian language teacher at Thomas Jefferson High School, Science and Technology in Alexandria, Virginia. Then we're going to hear from Tom Garza, Distinguished Teaching Associate Professor, Director of the Liberal Arts Texas Language Center at University of Texas in Austin. And he also served on the task force to revise the standards for teaching Russian. And then we'll wrap it up with Ben Rifkin, professor of Russian and Hofstra, who's going to talk to us about using the standards and articulating standards for purposes of things like recruitment, et cetera, right? Assessment along the way. So I'm going to turn it over to Jane. And so if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I will kind of collect them. I and Irina will collect them and we'll make sure that we get to them, but we'll also have a chance for you to ask questions live. Just to give us an idea of how many of you are here that teach in the K-12, can you raise your hand if you teach K-12?
Actually, we're gonna do a quick.
Oh, you want to do a poll? Oh, okay.
We're gonna be open right in a second.
There you go. Yep. We just wanted to kind of get an idea of the mix, and then you'll all see this. It'll be a little bit easier. And we're going to turn it over to Jane here.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. And
Sure.
Natasha, I'm going to ask you to start the slideshow, share the screen, whatever you call it. I don't have very many slides, but I did want you to see a few things. These, of course, are the 5 C's, intertwined as they always are. And I'm going to give you some background on kind of the history of how this all came about and how ACTR and I got involved. So the standards for learning Russian K-12 came about as part of a national initiative to set standards for all the major disciplines in American public schools. Foreign languages was, of course, the last curriculum area to receive funding. It was part of the Goals 2000 Educate America Act, and grants from the US Department of Education actually allowed work to begin on the standards for foreign languages. ACTFL was brought in to organize the effort, and Christine Brown from Glastonbury, Connecticut, was asked to head the initial task force. At the beginning, and we can go to the next slide, Natasha, that's okay. Oops. There we go. So initially, it only involved 3 foreign languages, and to nobody's surprise, those are French, German, and Spanish. But after a certain time, the task force decided to add more languages while they worked on a generic version of the standards. They kind of had a framework written. ACTFL reached out to ACTR, and I remember sitting in a board meeting where this work was kind of mentioned in passing. And I remember speaking up in those days. Ben and Tom may not believe this, but I was actually quite shy on the ACTR board. That changed. But at any rate, I remember speaking up and saying that this sounded really important and we probably should be involved. So of course, next thing I knew, Dan Davidson was on the phone asking me to go to a meeting in Salt Lake City in the summer, which at that point involved the representatives from the other language organizations that had been added, that is to say, classics, Chinese, Japanese, Italian, and Russian. It was a very productive meeting in Salt Lake City, and I was given kind of a draft version of the generic standards to read before I got there, and immediately they resonated with me. I really focused on the concept that these were about what students would do with the language instead of what they would know about the language, which was kind of the way I was taught. I could analyze French literature in terms of the use of the pluperfect subjunctive, for example. And I remember sitting in an early level French class in my high school. We'd been given a little short story to read about a little girl who was going somewhere with her father. And my teacher started asking questions to make sure we'd done the reading. Well, that's fine. But after a while, I thought, why in the world isn't she asking us questions about ourselves? And that to me that's the difference between the way I was taught and using the standards. So here's kind of a history of it. The first volume was published in 1996, Standards for Foreign Language Learning in the 21st Century, K-12. And note that post-secondary was not part of the grant, was not part of any of the other standards, and it really only went up to grade 12. Then, of course, we went on to, we formed our task force, and we had a great time working on the standards. It was hard work. We had meetings in Washington, D.C. with representatives from all the other languages, and then that did lead to the 1996 publication, which of course was then followed by another edition in 1999 that added Arabic. And then, of course, the World Readiness Standards in 2015. And by then, Tom and Peter Merrill and I were working on a revision of the standards that would finally add post-secondary material for everyone here who's in post-secondary education. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, Natasha. Because we often hear these referred to as, quote, the ACTFL standards. No, they are not the ACTFL standards. ACTFL does not own them. We do. ACTR owns the standards, the Russian standards, as part of the Standards Collaborative, which consists of all the organizations whose languages are part of the World Readiness Standards. And if you are citing the standards, it is the correct way to list the author, the writer, is the Standards Collaborative Board. ACTFL's role is to publish the standards, or was to publish the standards, but each language group kind of owns its own, although all those standards follow kind of the same format, which was set in terms of the standards for other disciplines as well. Now, I want to tell you one story that you will want to think that I made up, but it is absolutely true. So let's go to the next slide, Natasha. And it will take a minute. Okay, so when I was working on the standards, I got really excited about them. And I decided to start the school year with my Russian 1 class by telling them all about these wonderful standards. And then I thought and said, no, I'm not going to do that. So when they came in the first day, I sat them down and I said, so what is it that you expect? What do you want out of studying a new language? And here's what they said. I think we have to, yeah. Emily said, I'd like to know what the Russian kids are saying and talk to them in Russian. We had so many emigres in the school at that point that you couldn't walk around the corridors without hearing Russian. And then David said, click again, when you talk to Russians like the ones on my soccer team, you can find out what they're like and the way they live. And then Liz said, when you learn a language, you can learn about things like music and art and history. And Alex said, you can compare their traditions and their ideas, what we do in America. And finally, Igor said, I mostly want to be able to understand the letters from my grandparents in Kiev and be able to write back to them. Well, folks, what have they done? They have managed to name exactly each one of the 5 C's: culture, communication, what the Russian kids are saying; culture, you can find out what they're like; connections, you learn about things like music and art and history; comparisons; and finally, communities, using it outside the classroom. Not only did they name the goals, they named them exactly in the order in which they appear in the standards volume. So I think that tells you how useful, important these standards can be for your students and your teaching. And I think I've probably used up my allotted time. So I'll turn this over to somebody else. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jane. I think it's really important to know that kind of where it came from, right, and the history. So thanks for that. I'm sure that not everybody was aware of that that sort of developmental process there. Betsy, let's hear from Betsy Sandstrom.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Natasha will share my slides in just a second. And I'm like Jane, I'm going to share some stories about, we're getting there, just about some things happening in my school, in our Russian language program. And we'll see just what it looks like to be learning with the standards. And here we go. Okay, I think we can. So it might have said ideas for teaching language with the standards, and I changed it to learning because we're really focusing on the learners of the language here. So we can go to the next slide, Natasha. So what I found interesting this year, more so than in other years, we would try to take what we were learning in Russian class and see how it connected to what students were learning in their other classes. And frequently, when we were practicing for the Olympiad or students were getting ready to participate in the ACTR, Russian Language Olympiad of Spoken Russian, they would come back mostly in our level 2 classes saying they were very excited because they started learning about Russian history in their history class, and they knew all about Peter the Great and could answer all these questions because they had been learning Russian. So through their language class, they were able to kind of shine in another class. Now the tables are kind of switched. It's really interesting. Some students came to me this year and said, my teacher wants me to do a presentation in our English Lit class on the system of Russian names. We're going to start reading Crime and Punishment. And as a pre-reading activity, she wanted my student to do a whole presentation on how Russian names work because students were getting confused over these names like Petrovna, Petrova. Is it the same person? It looks the same to somebody who is not familiar with the Russian language. And I went to a leadership team meeting, at our school where we had teacher leaders meeting with administration. And one teacher said, it was just at the beginning, she said, do you mind if I just play something for a moment? I just really want you guys to hear this. And and I was sitting right next to her, and she said, I think Betsy would really want to hear this. And she put her recording on, and it was my student. And she was reading a lot of Russian names and words from Crime and Punishment. And she had made an audio recording for the English teacher. I asked my student, did you go to the teacher and let her know you were taking Russian and learning Russian? And she said, no, she knew. She came to me. She sought me out. So the tables are kind of turned. Our colleagues are actually learning and investing time into finding out what students are learning what languages. And they're calling on them to do special projects in their classrooms. And it's really nice to see the kids feel really special. And this is not happening just in Russian, but in all languages. But it really makes them feel very special, like they are an expert here and they're using their language skills in another class during the day. I just shared this one with Jane and Natasha and Katya recently, where an English teacher of 10th grade students came to me saying he's having his students memorize texts or poems or speeches in other languages. And did I have some that I could suggest for the students learning Russian? And he has about 7 students in his class who are taking Russian or speak Russian at home. And they're going to learn a poem and come to yet another one of my classes and recite it for my level 3 class. And then I think we're supposed to vote on our best, on the one we like best, but we don't like doing that. So we'll probably give them all little prizes. But again, these are teachers in other subjects seeking out our students because they're learning languages. So Natasha, if you can go to the next slide, some of this we found out is happening because our students are taking our Russian Club and our Russian Honor Society out of the classroom. They are doing projects where they are, service projects mostly, where they are showing the school what they can do for them and give back to the school. So this was something they did last year when we were still home for the pandemic. We had not yet returned to school, and our students recognized that the teachers had been working really hard the year before when we left for the pandemic and now during the pandemic. And they wanted to do a service project using their Russian that involve the whole school community. So they wrote this little message that's on the, I don't know if you're looking at it, Happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much for all you do. That was an email message that they sent to all of the teachers. And then what they did, they put this heart of pictures. Those are the students who were involved in the project. And they added that to the email message. And then they put a couple of, I just captured some of the messages they wrote to the teachers. And the teachers woke up to this, receiving this message. And the teachers now really make a connection to Russian is being taught in our school. And they are making academic connections now with their curriculum and Russian language, simply because they have become aware in our community that Russian is there. It used to be very small, the thing that those students did, that's happened inside the Russian classroom. But now it's really front and center because the students are really excited to show off what they know about Russian culture, Russian language, and share that with the community. So I won't read these quotes. There's a quote here on the side. You can take a look at that and see that's a lovely message for any teacher to wake up to in the morning. And then Natasha, if you can go to the next slide, there's a couple more quotes and we won't stay on these for very long, just take a glance. But these were written by students who are really excited about learning Russian language and other languages too. But look at the student, I really want to emphasize that this is not the student who wrote the middle school and elementary school. I felt like learning languages was a chore and I hated having to memorize different conjugations and taking tests and having to sit through boring PowerPoints. So what the student, this is not, by the way, to say that that's what happens in all middle school and elementary schools, but the point is that the students really, really appreciate the opportunity to use the standards in the classroom, to learn to communicate, to have a reason for learning the language beyond taking conjugation tests and learning conjugation. So I think that's what they're trying to say. They see their progress. And that's what it means when you are working with a standards-based curriculum, that the students get to measure their progress. And so if we can go on to the next slide. This was a big project we did at our school that connected so many things together. So one common activity that I think has been done for years and years and years is having some kind of a partner school, or even if it's pen pals, and making a connection with another school. So this particular project we brought to a brand new level. And so it's called the Global Classroom, and that's the name of our school, Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. RENEPA is the acronym for the school in Russia that we partnered with. And in parentheses, I wrote below, and the Global Classroom is their very important, actually, part of this. But below, and I think I just have a few more minutes left, but below I wrote Classroom School, School District Moscow, because this is how we've extended this learning. We started the whole project because there's Russian language in the school, in the classroom. It got brought to the school level because we were going to work on research projects that could involve students, mostly because there was so much interest when the school heard about this project that we were doing, where they were going to work collaboratively on research projects. We had students coming just from all over saying, we really want to be a part of this. Can we be a part of it, even though we're not in Russian language classes? So we opened it up, and I was working with a teacher who teaches society and law, a math teacher, a teacher from our economics department. And the neat thing is they all speak Russian. So the teacher who teaches society and law is a very fluent Russian speaker. His wife is from Belarus, and he has visited many times. The math teacher teaches high-level math, the highest level. The students have enormous respect for him, and he studied Russian in college. So what is a really good thing there is he was working on this team, and the kids are teaching him Russian. While they see him usually in this role of being the expert, he kind of put himself right down there and said, now you're my teachers. and I need your help with this. And our economics teacher is from Georgia, country of Georgia. And so all of them joined together with us on this project. And so now it has become school-wide, where we created teams of students from our school with students who came from Russia. We had 17 students from Russia. We had 34 from our school, just because we had to expand because the interest was so great. And they came and visited for 2 weeks. The students formed their teams and started working on their projects. And I'll show you the projects just briefly in a moment, but the school district became involved. So we've never had a Russian program take up so many of the resources of the school. We had in our school, the principal, the head of our technology department, meeting together on Zoom with the principal from the other school. It hasn't happened like that before. And it was because the energy was there for learning language and working collaboratively on research projects that were interest of both the Russian students and the American students. They decided their projects together. And you can go to the next one, Natasha. These were some of the teams. We had 8 teams. Those were the topics that the students decided on: comparative law, healthcare, smart cities, culture and education, urban life and governance. When the other teachers and we had 4 teachers from Russia too working together. And what was really neat, one of their teachers was an assistant principal. The assistant principal for world languages at my school became good buddies with him. So everybody partnered on this, and it brought the whole school community together. And they were all learning Russian while they were doing it. So we looked at this and said, oh my gosh, culture and education, it's huge. What are these students going to do? How do you do a project and present on something like culture and education, urban life and governance? So if you can go to the next slide. I'll show you just a couple of the questions that they had. In healthcare, there's the question. And I looked at their more refined question as they began their research, and they really zoned in on studying what emergency care was like in both countries and what people pay and don't know they have to pay for when you get emergency care. And the conversations that went on between the Russian students and the American students were just fantastic. And what they did every time they had a conversation, they recorded it, took notes on it, and those would appear in Russian and English because they were going to eventually present this at a symposium in Moscow. There you can see the question, one of the questions that one of the Smart Cities team had. And Natasha, if we can go to the next one. Again, more work from a couple of our teams, the culture and education. There was one question, there were 2 teams. One of them said, what are the most efficient methods that can be used to prevent overeducation and underemployment? And they researched what fields of study in the United States, people, and in Russia, people were getting degrees in that for which they were then overeducated because they weren't getting employment at that level. And that's what they started to look at when they go to the university. These were students who were, we only worked with upper level students, juniors and seniors. And they were really interested in what am I going to, they were doing this research to figure out what am I going to study in college for which I will be educated and prepared to get a job. And they focused on business mostly. Urban life and governance, just how to make local municipal government effective. The students coming from Russia were at a school from which most of them were going to go into the field of public service. So this was really, really important to them. And we had students who were very interested in that as well. And you can just look at some of the lists that they had together there. This is what they did. You can go to the next slide. For on the left side, student teams will produce a website, a white paper, and from the team of 4 teachers from the United States and from Russia, we guided them on this. We gave them samples of what a white paper looked like, what would be expected in a white paper, what the website should serve, what the multimedia presentation should look like when they go to the symposium in Moscow to present. And while the presentation officially was supposed to be in English, they were allowing my students to also present parts in Russian because we were working on this in Russian class, which, by the way, started to include more students who wanted to work on research and be a part of this. So we extended that to students in Russian language classes. And again, now these are huge topics, and we brought it down to what they could do with the language and not say it has to be kind of dummied up because they don't have the Russian skills for it. They brought their skills to it. And it was very exciting for them. Sadly, we did not go to Moscow 10 days before our trip. Their school went into quarantine. A group had gone to Spain and come back and infected the school, and their school went into quarantine with COVID, and our schools shut down and all international travel stopped. So we missed out on the actual symposium in Moscow, which was a little bit sad for them. But I also just wanted to say for these, for the research projects they did, they also reached out to communities. They were writing to senators, they were writing to local delegates, they were writing to people in business and urban planning, in smart cities planning. So they were getting experts involved in their research and responding to it. And then we just had, even though this was not for a grade, this was all volunteer on their side. This was above and beyond what they were doing in their classrooms. But they wanted to know what would it look like? How would we tell them if their paper was strong enough? And so we had our assessment over here, if they made it to global citizen or world traveler, first time flyer, road tripper, and local commuter. And so we would give them feedback on different parts of their projects as they went along. And I know am I close to time? You guys can tell me if I'm over time. So here's just some pictures of what this might look like. The top center, we have Russian and American students working together. That was shortly before they were going to go back to Russia. We had in the middle, there is culture and education group working together in the classroom. And then those groups would actually teach a lesson on language and the topic to the students in the classroom who weren't part of the research groups. And so they had student teachers from the US and Russia leading those lessons. When the students did the project for the community, school community, there are the little candies with notes that they gave to the teachers. And then the left side is my classroom. That's standards in action in the classroom. We were playing a game there, The Price is Right, and they had to match prices with Russian culture objects like samovar and matroshka and things like this. And I get to choose the prices of things. So I could make a chocolate bar cost 5,000 rubles and the samovar cost 3 rubles, and they would get it wrong just because I was obnoxious, but they had fun doing it. And we tried to keep, even during COVID, you can see they're in masks, there's 30 students sitting in the room, but we tried to keep them busy and doing things. So if they're going to buy something, they're going to get up and buy it. They're not going to sit and fill out a worksheet to do that. And there we have it. That's what I have for you.
Thank you, Betsy. That sounds like just an amazing collaboration. Yeah, amazing. And including all 5 C's in that project, whether the students realize it or not, it's really, you really should showcase that somewhere. That really is fabulous.
Thank you.
Okay, Tom, let's hear from Tom Garza.
Thanks so much. It's a hard act there to follow, but I'll do my best. I've also become kind of, in the last 2 years, COVID, the lockdown has not treated me well, in the sense of it's also coincided with a lot of self-reflection on my own identity, as many of us have had to do during this time. And so I've kind of become, in my own Mexicanness, that the uncle that sells insurance that comes to your Thanksgiving and ruins everything by trying to sell everyone at the table insurance. I've kind of made it that every talk I give, in some way or another, I want to connect to diversity, equity, and inclusivity in what we do, because it is simply now, in my estimation, one of the most important things we can do in our profession to keep Russian being taught K through 16 and beyond. I want to kind of emphasize at the beginning as well, since my two colleagues before me did such a beautiful job of talking about a bit of the history of how we got to here, and also a kind of expression of how we can use these in the classroom. Maybe try to give those of you who are in the university college set, post-secondary set, some ideas, not just on how to employ these within your immediate coursework, but also how to broaden these out in terms of their breadth to bring more students in, especially students of color, students from underrepresented populations in terms of income, gender equity, and so forth. I will talk more about that as we get to it. In that respect, I want to talk about the beginnings. Jane started us off that we know the standards came as part of the Goals 2000 movement. This was a much larger, much more comprehensive movement of standards for all of education. But at the root of it all, on the bad side, yeah, there was the No Child Left Behind side, which was a very much a double-edged sword. But at the root of it that I like to take away as the most important part of the global standards movement of 2000 was that standards were to apply to every student, every learner. And that indeed was a lot behind the revision of the standards, as Jane talked about from our, actually, I want to minimize the pictures there because I realize they're probably blocking part of the screen. The standards move toward inclusivity actually is embedded within the movement of the standards from their 1999 version to the 2015 version. It wasn't simply about let's include post-secondary, but actually make them more inclusive generally. So the statement, and I know I'm reading a lot into this because the word inclusion is used here. The inclusion of post-secondary programs in the language-specific standards documents ensures a seamless continuity, student-centered articulation, and high levels of performance among graduates. So the word inclusion here is simply saying we're also going to include post-secondary in our K through 12 standards and broaden them out. But beyond that, this idea that we're going to focus more on student-centered starts to talk about inclusion as part of a larger inclusivity movement of bringing students into that picture. So a couple of real simple ways that the standards shifted, which I like, because some of them are very symbolic looking, but there's a lot of language behind symbolism. And so one of the ones I love to hang on to is the old symbol of the 5 C's that most of us are used to, and all the 5 individual interlocking circles versus the new 5 C's that's actually one single multicolored ribbon that simply folds itself over. Now that seems really kind of trivial, but it's a really nice symbol for us to hold on to in terms of not simply having a hierarchy, another hierarchy in education of communication is the most important because it's at the top, then communities and cultures are next. At the bottom are comparisons and connections. Instead, even though we can still see the same kind, in fact, of naming of the 5 C's, this single ribbon gives much more the sense that they are indeed one large unit. Again, symbolic, but actually there's much more to it than simple symbolism. In a similar vein, from the 1999 version to the 2020 version, when in the Russian standards, a simple shift of actually naming the goal numbers by number. So communication was called, as you can see on the left, goal 1, and then actually enumerating the standards with decimal points, no less, right? So you've got not just standard 1 of goal 1, but standard 1.1, and then 1.2, and so on. In the new version, we've eliminated all of those. Communication is simply listed along with the others, and that just, again, helps learners, but most importantly, I think, from the perspective especially of K through 16, those of us who are teaching the languages, that all of these 5 C areas are part of the larger landscape that we're working with. So I'll start with the bad news in talking about DEIA and standards in general. And I'll use I take every opportunity I can. This particular volume, I know a lot of you know this already. This is Tim Regan's and Terry Osborne's wonderful, wonderful compilation called World Language Education as Critical Pedagogy, The Promise of Social Justice, which came out right at the beginning of last year. It's just a wonderful resource for those of you interested in looking at diversity and equity in language teaching. And I know a lot of people know this source, but I'm going to keep yelling it from the highest mountaintop until everyone has read it, because I think it really is that important. They talk about their view of the standards in their very last chapter quite pointedly. And indeed, they name that last chapter, chapter 10, Critical Pedagogy, Social Justice, and National Standards, more globally national standards. That is the entirety of the standards movement that came out of 1999-2000, of which the World Readiness Standards are part. The subtitle of that chapter, wait for it, An Insurmountable Dilemma, question mark. And that gives you some sense of where they're going to go in this chapter. And indeed, it begins with a very critical, negatively critical look at the standards movement, the idea of imposing from above a hierarchical set of standards for education that are essentially, because of who creates them and in what environment they're created, a hotbed for inequities and exclusivity rather than inclusivity. But they make an interesting point as they specifically start looking at what the World Readiness language standards can do, and ultimately come to this conclusion. Now, the good news. We believe that a critical pedagogy of world language education can be reasonably consistent with the, and yes, Jane, you were quite right, they make the mistake here too, ACTFL standards, even given the commodification and marketization of the standards, which characterizes the current milieu in world language education. So though they're still opposed to the idea that we're in a way marketing standards globally, more comprehensively, they still see some benefit that having the world language, the world readiness language standards can offer, in particular, certain areas of them, the foreign language or the world language educational endeavor. So I want to focus on those that they and a couple of their predecessors in just two quick remarks here as kind of where we can really center our efforts in K through 16 use of the standards. And this piece actually predates the very large movement in the spring of 2020 that was brought forward largely by a lot of social injustices and the Black Lives movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and other real kind of wellspringing of social justice movements that happened to coincide with COVID, probably not coincidentally. This is from 2017, Linwood Randolph Jr. and Stacey Johnson's piece called Social Justice in the Language Classroom, a Call to Action. And they contend that language, culture, and community, and they really are focusing indeed on two of the five seeds, the culture and the communities portions of the five seeds are inextricably connected. The language education classroom provides the ideal context for entering critical, transformative spaces of culture and community study informed by a social justice network. And so those are the two pieces that they really want to focus, and they focus in on in their work. I'm going to also kind of use in my last couple of minutes here, those two to really try to hone in on a couple of places where I think we as educators, and especially I think in the post-secondary sphere, where we have older learners, can use these standards to help us attain social justice goals in diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So one of the first ones, in looking at the standards and cultures, if you look at the 1999 descriptor on the left, simply it's rather generic and a lot more vague, gain knowledge and understanding of other cultures, fairly open-ended and vague. The World Readiness Standards in 2015 volume states, interact with cultural competence and understanding. Learners use the language to investigate, explain, and reflect on the relationship between practices and perspectives. It's suddenly now become a much more interactive standard, it's also become a lot more attuned to this idea of education, language education, as being transformative. And indeed, this would be kind of the sequence that I would pose if in using this and trying to use these standards in my own classrooms, is bringing in this idea of intercultural competence, ICC, as diverse. That is, we can also take a third standard, comparisons. My culture compared to yours, looking at the comparisons, not just within the culture, but beyond that culture. Then examining the second culture, or beyond the first culture, through the lens of the first culture, using the new language and the context of that language to help our learners move toward critical engagement. Not simply knowing, as Jane mentioned, this isn't just about knowing the facts and details of a culture. This is a matryoshka, this is a borscht, and so forth, but rather, what is it specifically about a culture of food, a culture of play, a culture of social interaction within the target culture that resonates with their own, That's where critical engagement with culture happens. That's the third part, transformative language learning. And this is very much at the root of Paulo Freire's conscientization, his very complicated, but actually incredibly pithy notion of the process of developing critical awareness in one's social reality through reflection. That is reflection, really making critical comparisons and action. Projects very much of the type that Betsy's students were engaged in, as she showed us in her presentation. And the place of culture actually is written right into the ACTFL Statement on Diversity, which again, interestingly, they put up on their website a full year before most of us started even considering thinking about a DEI statement on our websites in scholarly organizations, professional organizations. ACTFL's May 2019 diversity statement begins with ACTFL believes strongly in equal access to world language study and equitable opportunities to all individuals to develop linguistic and cultural competence and pedagogical knowledge, and then goes on in the next paragraph to talk about, and I love this point, that they simply alphabetize all of the different attributes that come into a good DEIA statement: age, beliefs, disabilities, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, gender expression, language identity, national origin, race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and any other visible or non-visible attributes. It's actually just a terrific, terrific and fully encompassing statement. The standards and communities, and with this I'm going to finish. Community engagement. I'm stealing actually from Uju Anya's and again Randolph one more time from their work from 2019, Diversified Language Educators and Learners. This is from the ACTFL special issue of the Language Educator from 2019, which was devoted to issues of DEI and language. They contend that successful language programs that promote diversity require buy-in and support from the communities of the language learners. Part of the community engagement also involves language learners' connections and interaction with diverse speech communities, a little bit of translanguaging commentary here, of the languages being studied, the communities component they mention of the World Readiness Standards for Learning Languages. So what this looks like, and I'm going to end with this, in our brief for today, we were all asked to think about questions we might pose back to all of you as well to think about and maybe frame in our Q&A session after the last presenter. So questions in making the standards communities part really work. How do the language programs that we are in build successful partnerships with communities? How can we do that? Again, already you got a couple of ideas in the K through 12 setting from Betsy there. What are successful approaches to service learning and related experiences that challenge deficit models of community engagement? Deficit model here referring to the unfortunate affect of racial inequity in which minority populations feel or are being told consistently that their cultural standards and their cultural norms and indeed themselves are lesser than those of the majority population. It's kind of the root cause of imposter syndrome among so many minority students. I speak here from firsthand experience about deficit modeling of community engagement. How do we approach doing that kind of community service with students of color or other minority students? How do we ensure equitable access to traditionally prestigious forms of community engagement? And here obviously jumps right out study abroad, for example. What happens to this fairly rarefied kind of the European experience, as it were, back in the 19th century for the gentry class? How do we make that part of the entirety of what it is that we do? And so with that, I would just simply finish with calling out the works that I cited here and adding a couple of others, drawing your attention at the very last one, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but right above it, Donaldo Macedo's wonderful collection. He's edited this volume, Decolonizing Foreign Language Education, the Misteaching of English and Other Colonial Languages, including, in that vein, Russian. With that, I'll leave it and hope I can get some of your wonderful questions following our discussion today. Thank you all.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, thank you. Those were all really, really amazing contributions to our webinar tonight. So thanks for that. The floor is open. I don't see, excuse me, I don't see questions in the chat. So if anybody wants to raise a hand.
We still need to hear from Ben. Yes.
Ben, we still have Ben.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ben. Oh, Ben. Oh, how could I forget Ben? Ben, where are you? I don't see you on here. That's why I was thinking we're wrapping up with Tom there. No, Ben, please.
I think I'm up next.
You are.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. And
I was looking at the time and it's 5:55, but that's okay, Ben. We're not going to shortchange you on the time.
aren't we going to 6:30?
We are. We're going to 6:30. We thought we'd
Okay.
get the presentations in an hour and have a half an hour for discussion, but that's fine. We're not
Okay.
going to cut your time.
Okay. So I'm not a sports fan, but in any way for any sport. But for baseball, I feel like I'm batting cleanup here, because what I'm going to do is focus on how we can use the World Readiness Standards to build enrollments so that our programs are not your grandfather's Russian program, so to speak. And so for those of you who are not aware, you need to be aware that colleges and universities around the country have been shedding foreign language programs at a horrific rate. So this is an article from a couple of years ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education that reports 650 programs cut in 3 years, and the previous 5 years before that had like 6 programs cut. And we're having significant demographic trends that are leading to lower enrollments overall in higher education, especially in certain parts of the country. And with lower birth rates in particular periods of time, including the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and again in the during the last few years, birth rates have been down. So under more different circumstances, our country would have increased immigration. That hasn't happened, in case you have been in a coma for a few years. So we're going to have fewer and fewer students going to college. And in addition to those demographic issues, we have increasingly loud voices advocating against college, that you don't need college, college is not a good thing, so don't go. And so, as you know, I am a professor of Russian, I've been a dean, I've been a provost, and I can tell you that we cannot afford to be low-hanging fruit at the time of budget cuts. So here's the secret about budget cuts. No matter where you are in the financial cycle, they're coming. They're coming. And the person who's going to make those cuts is always going to look for the lowest hanging fruit. The standards are your way to get your fruit higher in the tree. And I can tell you, as a dean and as a provost, when I had to make cuts, including at the beginning of the pandemic, I went for my lowest hanging fruit, and everybody will. So there's nothing you can do about it. If you need to prepare now so that you're not the lowest hanging fruit. And you need to think about who are your stakeholders. And I put a list here that's relevant mostly for post-secondary. And you need to think about what they want, what they care about, and what's important to them. And in thinking about your program and its outcomes and how you publicize and celebrate it. In this context, I'm sharing a chart with you that shows on the bottom axis, and this is based on research that I published in 2005 in the Modern Language Journal, that the number of hours of formal classroom contact time with outcomes in the 4 modalities according to the proficiency guidelines. And so it turns out that the receptive skills are pretty much aligned in terms of the slope of their difficulty, and the productive skills are just a little bit higher. In fact, the speaking and writing are the same line. You can't really see the writing, it's hidden right behind the speaking line. But the key thing is that, you know, if we think about advanced level proficiency as the minimum level for professional engagement, then in fact, you know, it takes close to 600 hours to get there. And very few majors in the country have those hours, if any. And so we have a challenge of, you know, looking at, you know, typically 1 year of classroom instruction, you know, in Russian, depending on the number of contact hours, we may get students to novice high or intermediate low. Another year, we could get them to intermediate low, with our best students getting to intermediate mid. And then 2 more years of classroom instruction without study abroad, they're still at the intermediate mid level. So that's one of the reasons why deans and provosts think I could just cancel this, because they're not getting to professional use of the language. So why should I, you know, have language programs? And, you know, so we have to think about what we count, what we value. When I was a student when I arrived at Middlebury to study in the Russian school as a student back in 1980, I had to take a placement test in which I had to write out the date, including the year, and it was 1980. So, you know, there's a little bit of a complication right there with 80-10. And if I made any mistake, then that would count against my placement. And how often do Russians write out the year in words? You know, what's the authenticity of that task? And you can see on the left, I've raised questions about, you know, what do we count? What's valuable in terms of those things on the left? And the thing that I put on the right is this. We have to think about what we value, and we have to count it, because by default, we're valuing only the things we count. And so my grandfather's Russian program, if he were to have had one, you know, would have focused on conjugation and declension paradigms and translating sentences. But if we stick to that, our enrollments are going to flop, and we will see our programs destroyed when we retire, if not before, depending on what our employment status is. So I very much link the standards to the essential learning outcomes of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the AAC&U, whose website is aacu.org. And you can see on the left the list of the goals for a liberal arts education. And if these are not all of them, there are some math and science things I left out, but they're in there too. But these are the ones that, for me, automatically, I'm like, oh yeah, we do all this stuff in teaching language. Every single thing that's here is part of what we do. And we just need to think about that and connect it to our standards. And those essential learning outcomes are tied to these things that you see on the right in terms of progressively more challenging problems, work that's anchored in active involvement with diverse communities with real life and authentic challenges, and success demonstrated in unrehearsed novel settings. And that's proficiency, and that's the standards. So we need to link with those. And the ACNU has rubrics for all these things that are free for the download. They're called value rubrics. And value is like one of the world's best acronyms I've ever encountered. It stands for Valid Assessment of Learning in Undergraduate Education. Is that not beautiful? So these, you can download them, you can adapt them, you can use them as they are. They're there, they're great. And I'm going to show you one. I'm not going to go over it, but you can see this is the critical thinking value rubric. And you can just get a sense of, and what it's like. And there's a whole other page with definitions. And so, I want us to think about connecting our world readiness standards to those liberal arts outcomes. And you could take one of our world readiness standards and create an activity that links up to a bunch of the essential skills that are on the right. And I just picked one, like a project on culture as defined by the world readiness standards. And I can, immediately connect it to inquiry analysis, information literacy, teamwork, intercultural knowledge, written and oral communication, and I could do more. And you can actually, mix and match easily from the left side to the right side. And, so for instance, I did a lot of work on oral history projects, and that's the chapter in The Art of Russian that my co-authors and I have. So there's a link to that. And my students did, I did a project where my students did oral history interviews, and they interviewed an immigrant who started talking about Vysotsky. And my students didn't know who Vysotsky was. Well, that's a culture project for them. And they'll find out about Vysotsky, and they'll present to my class in Russian, another class in English. It's great. Making connections. Students work individually or in groups to explore something through web-based research that they can only access in Russian. So, and there are some examples here that you can use for a connections project. And the students are choosing the things they want to work on. That's so important. And then comparisons. Students work in individuals or individually or in groups on a comparative topic of their choice. And here the photo is an image from the demonstrations about the forest in Khimki. So, and the students work together on these things, and they're very excited. So for an oral history project, for instance, that could be a group project, that could be individually, and it connects them into the communities. So what happens with these projects? So first of all, really encourage us to think about our Russian programs as an opportunity to bring students together across the levels. So if we compare the Russian curriculum at any of our institutions, typically our students only know the students in the same level. So I think that it was maybe only 15 years ago that it was pointed out to me that Michael Wachtel, professor of Russian at Princeton University, and I graduated the same year from the same undergraduate institution with the same major, but we never met because we were in different levels of Russian. And so by doing team projects by topic that the students pick, they could get involved across levels. Older students mentor younger ones. Younger students get to meet students who've come back from study abroad. It really generates buzz. And then we have events where we bring students together for a research fair, for performances, for the demonstration of multimedia projects. And we invite the broadest possible community in post-pandemic circumstances. So that's community members who are Russian speakers, who are not, parents of our students, if that's appropriate and they're in the community, ask students to invite their friends who then sign up for Russian classes, because this stuff is fun. They enjoy it. And then how do we assess it? Well, we can look at the rubrics, the value rubrics. We can create our own, and we can calculate the percentage of students in the class who on their project have met or exceeded expectations, not only in language, but also in those liberal arts learning outcomes that I talked about at the beginning, those essential skills. And then we can tell our deans that 85% of the students in my class demonstrated teamwork at the level of milestone in the value rubric, which is nationally validated, which is one of our goals for our liberal arts program for our entire university. So document, publicize, celebrate, get the information to your department chair and your dean, and your students are also going to share the information. But bear in mind that whatever fabulous things you do never happened at all if you didn't do these things on social media. And you can have a student help you with this, but you've got to get photographs, you've got to get recording, you've got to get audio. It's with pre-college, it's harder in terms of the issue of they're minors and their parents have to consent, and that's very challenging. But with the students, you can just ask them if they consent, they can sign a form, and they're right there, they don't have to take it to their parents. But it gets the buzz going. And apply the 5 C's to your programs. Communicate with your stakeholders. Understand their culture, what they need. Compare your program's metrics with the metrics that matter to your stakeholders. Connect your program with the other programs and partners on and beyond campus. So for me, as a professor of Russian, one of my most important partners is the history department, and establish communities on and beyond campus. And that really helps your program grow. And when you grow, you get great roots and your fruit comes out on top. Your students become your recruiters and your alumni fans. And being connected with them on LinkedIn helps support your program. And here I just want to very briefly share with you an episode from my experience in the late 90s at Madison. We were still struggling to recover our enrollments from the collapse of the early 90s. And one of the things I would do right before the semester started, or a few days before the start of classes, is I would go to the bookstore and make sure that our textbooks were on the shelf. I didn't want a problem with that. We had some time that we could, have a little bit of delay with the alphabet, but we really needed, those books to be there. And I encountered a situation where 2 students were taking Russian Stage 1 off the shelf at the same time. And one of them said to the other, "Oh, are you taking Russian?" And the other one said, "Yeah, I heard it's a great program here at UW-Madison." And the first one said, "Yeah, me too." And I thought, I'm not saying a thing. I'm not introducing myself now. I'm walking away. That was the buzz I needed to create to bring students to me. And so by bringing the standards into the way you design the curriculum and connecting them to the essential learning outcomes, your program moves from the periphery, the margins of the university's curriculum to the center. And it's a landmark on students' journey of their own intellectual and personal development, which is not just about the conjugation of the verbs and the declension of the nouns. It's about communities and comparisons and connections and cultures. And by framing your curricular design around this, you will find students are excited to continue. And bear in mind that the things they learn in this way will be more meaningful for them as human beings and adults than being able to spell сегодня 15 июня 1980 года. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ben. My apologies again. That was fabulous. So I just want to add something that might tie a lot of this together as well. I think that the learning outcomes for the liberal arts are not just for the liberal arts. If you look at those learning outcomes, they're for everybody. And one of the arguments, and of course, I'll confess that I'm now running a strategic task force for thinking about the future of the School of Languages at Maryland. And we're thinking about all of these things, right? You do have to articulate your values so that people understand, why do you bother to come to us, right? And I think that long-term engagement with another language and culture, so it can start in K-12 and we want them to go on. Part of the idea of using the standards is to talk about that articulation, right? We don't just keep starting over at every new level. We want a kind of a long-term continuum, and the standards can help us do that. But what a long-term engagement does, it's always done, we just don't proclaim it always, is help you to learn to shift your frame, right? You start to understand there are different ways of seeing, right? There are different frames. My frame isn't always the only frame. In fact, it's almost never the only frame. And that's the beginning of diversity, inclusion, and equity as well. If you can't see that the other may not have the same frame as you, and you are not interested in trying to see what that other frame might see, then you don't have the ability to really make progress with equity, inclusion, diversity, right? It's about imagining the other, the frame of another, and then getting at high levels to imagine what you look like from the frame of the other, right? That's that deep reflection. So I think we have to make these cases beyond even language programs, language schools, liberal arts. I think we have to make it across the continuum, and why we are so vital to the sort of educational mission. That's what's truly transformative, is that we teach a long-term skill of learning to shift your frame. So I want to open it up for questions, but I think that kind of ties this all together, these standards, thinking about them across the curriculum, vertically, horizontally, not just in the liberal arts, but in STEM. Nobody's ever changed the world who's not able to look at a problem or an issue and say, there must be another way to look at this. Doesn't matter, pick a field, any field, that's what those creative thinkers do.
And Cindy, I agree with you. I just want to clarify that when I say liberal arts, I'm including the sciences.
The sciences, yeah.
I am, the natural sciences. And I also want to say that for students who are majoring in engineering and business, which I do not include in the liberal arts, or nursing, they need liberal arts content in order to be successful practitioners in their field. So although their professional schools are not delivering liberal arts coursework, they take it with the College of Liberal Arts or the College of Arts and Sciences or whatever it's called on your campus. So thank you.
Jane, you have your hand up. Let's go to Jane.
I do, and I think this question is mostly for Tom, but if anyone else has a thought on it, please step in. So Tom, I'm thinking when you said diverse and talking about culture, I'm really interested in the question of what Russian culture, or I would like to think of it as not just the culture of Russia, but Russophone, I guess that's the term, cultures, because that's very much, that varies. And I wonder if, well, especially, and I'll just give a couple of examples, as in, if we can, much as we all love Pushkin and we love Moscow and we love St. Petersburg, but maybe, just maybe, we could consider that there are other cultural practices and products beyond that, that, for example, if we want, within Russia, if we thought about Islamic culture in Russian, and then we're opening ourselves up to the diversity of our own students, some of whom may, by golly, be Muslim. Or another example, and Devin Brown wrote about it for the ACTR newsletter, he teaches a lot, well, not a lot, but some students, at least in his Russian program, are from Uzbekistan. So he has created a series of lessons based on Uzbek music. Mm-hmm. And I mean, these are Russian speakers. They're not, we're not talking about Uzbek speakers. Well, maybe they have both languages, but at any rate, those are just two examples of how we can use the cultures, plural, as a diversity tool, I guess. I mean, even here's a really basic example. Not all Russian poetry is written, but was written by men. We get into diversity and we forget that includes, we haven't really conquered the gender diversity issue. I mean, Akhmatova is certainly as much a poet as Pushkin's.
Absolutely, Jane. I mean, you articulated it all beautifully. I think whenever we talk about any academic teacher, any teacher, forget academic, any teacher who talks about DEIA, and the subject matter. It has to be both the subject and object of instruction. You have to be looking at your own, the learners that you have sitting in your classroom and the manner in which you're teaching them and the materials you bring in and so forth. And you also have to look at what is the object you're teaching. How can you look at it as diversely, as diversifiedly, if you will, as possible? Russia is so incredibly, as you pointed out, diverse, and this notion that, well, really aren't all those, if once we move past the Urals, aren't all those peoples really still considered to be white? Just no, just no. And so, yeah, we've got a really diverse place. And indeed, I would say you don't even have to worry about, decolonizing the syllabus doesn't mean we get rid of Pushkin, Lermontov, and so forth. It does mean contextualizing them differently. I'm using in a course right now in Chechnya that I teach on from the imperial time through the Chechen wars. And I teach Pushkin, I teach Lermontov, looking at things like Demon for Lermontov, and looking at things like Kafkatsky Plennik for Pushkin, and allowing students to see what does looking at another culture through the lens of empire do to distort, accurately display. What does it do to the culture that's being described? It really gives learners an incredible chance to then talk about their experiences that they're more closely tied to, good comparisons of culture, again, in their own cultures. So you're completely right. I try very much, obviously, to bring in Chechen perspectives as well. I've got a number of authors, including 2 women, Chechen writers. Kirloeva in particular, her work is in multi-languages, and she has been writing both in while she was living in Chechnya and also in emigration in Paris. So yeah, I think it's a wonderful way of using the standards both with our own students in addressing diversity, equity, inclusivity, and looking at the cultures, plural, and the Russians is, right, plural, in country as well. It's a terrific perspective. Thank you.
I like to use the phrase cultures of Russia and the Russophone world.
Yeah. I agree. We're lucky there's a wonderful now growing field of inquiry in the cultural linguistic realm of translanguaging, and Russia is certainly a part of that research, simply because there are so many, Ben, as you correctly point out, not just varieties and variations of Russian based on everything from gender to class to ethnicity, but specific to particular regions within that vast 11 time zone region. Yeah.
And beyond, I would think Israel would be case in point.
Absolutely. Yeah. I shouldn't talk just about the borders. You're absolutely right.
And of course, the United States.
And of course, the United States.
Yeah, I taught Russian history last semester, and in the first class, I gave the students a list of 100 different nationalities in the Russian Federation. And they worked in groups. I know you're all astonished to hear that I had a group activity. Try to contain yourself. And they worked in groups to learn as much as they could on with Wikipedia and other sources in 10 minutes about 3. I picked 3. And then they presented to each other about the 3 that they learned about. And I said to them, and this is just as many as I could fit on one page. And they were just shocked. One of the other things I'll share with you that I think I would do again in a language class, but this I did in a history class, was that I assigned my students, maybe in a language class I would let them pick, a social identity of someone who is not Russian and doesn't live in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And they had to, in a blog, respond to, because this was a history class, the impact of the big history they're reading about in the textbook on their family and their lives. And the goal of this was to develop their understanding of the bigger social complexities of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, Russian Federation, because the historical period covered all of those, or at least in part for the Russian Empire. And and also for them to increase their sense of compassion for and global citizenship to more deeply understand people from other backgrounds. And it was very successful. So because our textbooks are very, as Jane pointed out, very Moscow and St. Petersburg focused and very Russian focused. So one of the things that's really interesting to me in terms of, Tom, you mentioned your identity. So I'm Jewish. And a lot of American students of Russian are also Jewish.
Mhm.
We are nowhere in the textbooks. We are completely absent. We simply do not exist in the textbooks.
But boy, were they ever in my Russian classes. And
Yeah.
the whole issue of identity and the passport, wow.
Yeah, sure.
That was just,
Sure.
I know I've told this story before. I'll tell it really quickly. One little girl, that nationalist business.
Mhm.
And her family was fairly recent immigrants, but they were applying for US passports. And she came into class and she said, Mrs. Shuffleton, I had to explain to my father that under nationality, we don't have to put Jewish anymore.
Mhm. Yeah. For those of you who don't know, the emigration from the Russian Empire between 1881 and 1914 of people who were identified by the Russian Empire as Jews to this country was so great that virtually every American Jew who identifies as Ashkenazi, so not Sephardic, not from Spain originally, not from the Middle East, has at least one ancestor from the Pale of Settlement, at least one. And that drives interest for many students, including me.
Yeah.
So going back to what Tom said earlier, there's the curriculum, there are the materials, there are the people in the classroom, and there are your teaching practices. And all of them have to be tuned into diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I see a couple of interesting things in the chat. Maria, thanks for that. Kurt, you put an interesting thing in there as well. Let's see, we don't have a whole lot of time, but somebody have advice on how to talk about Krim? That could be a very long, maybe the topic of an entire webinar. I did want to say that I think ACTR has been offering webinars on diversifying our approach to all of the Russian speaking world, right? And identity issues. And so keep your eyes open for more. I think maybe we can do some more of those. Long thread about Krim. I think one of the hardest things in dealing with any of that is to get students to understand that how do we get to see what they see from inside, right? Not just what the American policymakers are seeing, but how do we find sources to see what the frame from the inside looks like before we start making judgments about anything? We have to first understand some of those other frames. And so I think finding sources to do that are accessible to students, probably a really good way to start. Maria, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Extremely inspiring, very helpful. So here's a question for everyone. I teach in a department that has all the languages together. We do not have a language requirement, only concentration requirement. How do we articulate to our administrators the value of knowing another language and another culture, where very often we are told, well, the internship will be in English, all the employers know English, but we all as language teachers, of course, we are convinced that it's the subtle communication, the small talk, that English will not get you there. Even if you work in English, that even the little conversational knowledge will take you so much longer. So I wonder, for those of you who supervise the programs and work at the dean's level, what's your advice on that to kind of, as Ben, as you said, how do we establish the value of what we teach in global languages departments? Thank you.
I may be the only one among us who's been a dean. And the problem I have in answering your question is that before I was a dean, and while I was a dean, I was keenly aware of my identity as a world language educator. And so nobody in our language departments had to convince me of the value. And before that, I taught in places where, it was valued. But in trying to help others, I find that the best way to do it is by using the standards and talking about how we teach through the standards, which I'm going to say I feel are, unfortunately named. I'm sorry, Jane, but, guidelines were already taken. I think of the standards really as curricular guidelines, and the proficiency guidelines really as performance benchmarks, but, that's just me. But, what I would say is to talk about the standards and how they connect to the learning outcomes of the AAC and U, and then also to share some examples of incidents in which people misspoke, thinking that they were translating correctly, but without the cultural understanding. So I had some Twitter exchange today with some wonderful Russophone friends about some of the challenges in translating Russian and English. And so we talked about how in some ways the phrase "to look forward" is easy to translate into Russian, but in the sense of, in my life, I'm looking forward to, those big issue things. Linguistically and culturally, that's impossible to do in Russian. The word, yes, перегрузка, also the word challenge can be very difficult. And on the other side, for me, it's always been very difficult to explain соборность to English speakers, and to share some of those examples from different languages and explain how it's only through the study of language and culture together in language that students begin to understand and develop global citizenship. And my recommendation for you is to look at the mission statement of your institution and find all the references to the words world, global, and international, and build your case on those. And one other thing for all of you who work at the post-secondary level, if you hear that there's going to be a committee to revise the mission, get on that committee so that you can make sure that the words world, global, and international are in the mission statement. Because without it, we don't have.
I would add that look for those diversity words too. We
had
a whole thing on campus where they were talking about intercultural communication and diversity, and they never even consulted the language school. They just were talking about it inside of American culture because American culture is diverse, right? And so students are going to need these intercultural competencies inside of an American English speaking workplace. And we were pulling our hair out and saying, how could you not be looking in our direction, right? So really, yeah, those are just some good strategies. But I think all of it is giving us a signal here in the chat that we are out of time. But the idea is to have a follow-up it's next Friday already on the 4th, right? And to have a teacher's lounge to follow up and have a discussion about this. So William, I see your hand is up. Are you going to be able to join us next week, or did you?
I had a quick question for Dr. Rifkin. That you having been a dean, Dr. Rifkin, is that something that is uncommon at the post-secondary level? Because in the 28 plus years I've been a K through 12 teacher, I have yet to meet one administrator in K through 12 that was world language, unless of course they're a department chair or working in the central office as the foreign language supervisor.
I can't speak for administration at K-12 because I don't go to those conferences. Yeah, but I can tell you that when I go to dean's conferences or conferences for provosts or higher ed leadership, I'm usually one of 2 to 3 people in a room with 1,000 whose background is in world language education.
So we probably need more people like you to be there.
I can speak very quickly as a high school teacher, and having had a principal who was not a language person, but loved the Russian program and would come to my class, went to Russia, went to Moscow, the superintendent went as well. And wow, it makes all the difference. If you are fortunate like that and have things that you can do in your classroom that the principal wants to come and look at, or the superintendent wants to come and look at.
Okay, it looks like we may have to wrap this up, but come next Friday. Come and join us next Friday for a
Thank you
to
very
be
much, everyone.
continued. Thank you, all of you, for your wonderful
all the
presentations.
presenters.
And
And yes,
have a great
join us for the
weekend.
Teachers Lounge. Join
Yes,
us
come next Friday.
next
And
Friday.
thank
Bring
you,
your ideas.
Olga and
Bring
Cindy
your ideas. Bring
and
your comments.
Natasha.
Absolutely, yes. Olga, thank you for all the organization behind the scenes, everybody on the committee. We'll see you next week.
Good to
Thanks,
see everybody.
everybody.
Stay
Bye.
safe, everyone.